Welcome, everybody, to the Lewis and Lucas podcast. I am one of your co-hosts, Lucas. Joining me, as always, is Lewis. How are you doing today, Lewis?
I am doing great. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. I'm excited about our topic today just because this was really how we got connected. Like we talked about in the first episode, was our fandom of this particular author. He does have some interesting ideas, but he also falls into his own logical traps. We're talking today about Nassim Nicholas Taleb, author of such books as Fooled by Randomness, Black Swan, Antifragile, Skin in the Game. So
yes.
Not everybody's familiar with Nassim like you and I are. And Lewis, you had some really good points about who he is and why people should care about him. Do you want to explain that to our audience?
Yeah, absolutely. So he is, first of all, I always say his name wrong. People always make fun of me when I'm talking about him. I say Taleb, and I think it's Taleb or Taleb or whatever. But anyway, I'm going to do my best. But Taleb is incredibly influential in a lot of different circles. So if you talk to people in kind of hedge fund trading, they all know who he is. He's very influential, kind of regularly referred to, wrote some textbooks in that space. He's also very influential in kind of risk avoidance at the national level. He's written technical papers that are used by governments around the world, so very influential on that front. But probably his biggest influence is on a cultural level. He's written several best-selling books. Many of the phrases he's used in those books have kind of entered popular language. As you mentioned, the word Black Swan is something that's regularly used even by people that have no idea who Taleb is. The phrase anti-fragile is a phrase that's regularly used by people that even when they don't know who Taleb is. So he's his books have had some influence culturally that have been important. And I think that has even been influential on the, in terms of policymakers and, people within, important groups have read him. I think there was a time when someone from the Trump administration was walking with a copy of Anti-Fragile under their arm or whatever. And then I think the other area he's influential is he's got a weird cult following. So not a lot of people. And I when we talked about doing this podcast, I was slightly concerned because I think a lot of people don't know who he is, and it might be a little bit inside baseball. But the people that do know him love, like there's this giant almost, and it is. I use the word cult, and I think it is. There almost is a religious element to it.
There's certainly a cult of personality with Taleb, right?
Yeah. And so this following will support him online, and almost like a cult leader, they will attack people that disagree with him. They will, use similar phrases to him, BSer or a bullshit detector or whatever. They have these phrases that they use, that he uses. And his followers will IYI, intellectual yet idiot. Yeah. A lot of phrases they'll use from him. And one aspect of that is strange and I think important is that a lot of those people would otherwise be good people, right? You look at like a Joe Norman of the world and seems like a pretty good guy. Like most of his takes are good. And then he was like, up until very recently, was a giant Taleb fan and would block people that disagreed with Taleb, et cetera, et cetera. So that's another area of him being influential. And then I'll touch on one last thing, because I think this is incredibly important, is I think he was incredibly influential on the COVID policy. He wrote a paper early on during COVID, I think early January 2020, basically talking about the importance of avoiding travel, avoiding risk, locking down, and using what in the paper was described as the precautionary principle. And based on many of Taleb's attitudes and teachings, that I think that influenced the Trump administration. I think that influenced other governments throughout the world. So that's why I think he's important, and maybe I'm giving him too much credit, but I do think he has had a lot of influence. So I don't know if there's anything you have to add to that, but
no, I think that's a perfect summary. And our conversation, we're going to start looking at some of the books his books that he's written.
But maybe we should also, before we go too far, in case people miss the first episode, we should also note that both of us are giant critics of Taleb, and that influence, I would say, is mostly not a good influence. Like especially on the case of his cult following, especially on the case of his precautionary principles and some of the other influences he's had on the world, I would say are mostly negative, especially on his COVID policy has been incredibly negative.
See, his cult following is known as I maybe we're using that term very loosely, but
I'm going to keep using it. I believe it.
Well, and like you said, there is this cult of personality. We were concerned, like maybe this is gonna, because they're pretty active on Twitter, right? The Real World Risk Institute, the RWR. If you look at hashtag RWRI, you'll see the Taleb fanboys going back and forth, calling out the BSers and all these different things. Yeah. So we were a little, and if they want to skewer us online, that's fine. Speaking of Twitter, though, a couple of house items before we get into our larger conversation about Taleb and how his ideas and how they've progressed over the years. Thank you, everybody who has liked our first episode. If you haven't checked us, this is just our second episode ever. So you're listening now, you're getting in while the getting's good. The big shout out to my favorite positive review that we got was from Francois. They gave us a big shout out, and a lot of people noticed us because of that. So thank you very much. And if at any point, Francois, you want to come onto the podcast, because we record on Saturday morning, which would be in France, I think that would be around, after lunch. So if it's a Saturday afternoon, you're like, what, I feel like talking to these guys, feel free to let us know. We'll happily scratch whatever it was we were going to talk about that day and have you on, because I'll post some things too. Like Francois uses Twitter in a really, really effective way. Lots of really intellectually interesting threads about all kinds of different topics, history, religion, the Enlightenment, and really the first critic of Taleb that really helped open my eyes to the foolishness of Taleb. So with that, let's get into Taleb. The first book that he wrote was Fooled by Randomness. This is back in 2001. The main points are data. When you look at aggregated data about any topic, oftentimes you're trying to find trends, but the data can be very noisy. You see when you look at traders, hedge fund guys, they talk about this a lot too. Oftentimes you're trying to find trends, whatever, and like, oh, look, here's a dot over here. This must mean we need to completely change our trading strategy. Well, you got fooled by the randomness, right? Life is full of random events, and we often get fooled by the data that we're looking at. We think we're seeing trends, and the trend isn't actually there.
Yeah, and that book, honestly, I like that book. Like, I think that book was really helpful for me. Often one of the interesting things that he talks about in that book is the fact that often there's this survivorship bias, right? So what we'll do is we'll say, this, one of the things he talks about is like this city of New York, after 9/11, people say it always bounces back. 100% of the time it's bounced back. It's, since the beginning of the US, New York has always bounced back. And you could say that for city of Rome. Like Rome always bounces back. It always comes back. Like there's always this thing. And he talks about the fact that that's a survivorship bias, right? Like we're like ultimately, you wouldn't say that if there was no New York anymore, right? Like
Right.
if tomorrow New York disappeared, or like it got bombed into the ground, there'd be no. So he does a lot of things where he kind of talks through data. He talks, he has a phrase something along the lines of uh, correlation isn't causation, but
Yeah.
then he also says correlation often isn't correlation, right? Like often the data that we think is correlating isn't actually. The other thing he talked about was the fact that if you are looking for a pattern in data, like many medical studies do, there's always going to be a pattern. There's always going to be something that correlates to something, right? Like, so if
Yeah.
you have a big messy piece of data and you say, okay, well, what correlates to someone who took aspirin every day, and you dig through that data and you're like, oh my goodness, they had toe injuries, and like the toe injury correlates almost perfectly with the aspirin. Well, that has nothing to do with it, right? Like that
Right.
just you
If
dug through the data and you found one point that happened to move in similar directions to the other point of data, but it is nothing involved. So all
yeah.
of that being said, like that's a very helpful point that I've found useful in my life.
Yes. It's and if you want to find a pattern, you can
yeah,
find a pattern.
yeah,
And unfortunately, policymakers, people who are very influential are subject to this logical fallacy of just here's what the data says, and here's the pattern that it found. And like, oh, here it confirms what we were looking for. Boom,
yeah,
correlation, causation,
yeah,
we're good to
yeah.
go. And actually, Taleb, I believe, introduced me to, I don't know if you're familiar with him, Gerd Gerzinger. He's a German author, wrote some really, really good books. I'll post that later. That goes into great detail about how medical doctors, especially, they did some actual studies to see if doctors understand statistics. Spoiler alert, they don't.
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
hard. Data's statistics, math is hard, and yeah, it's very easy to get fooled by randomness. Our life is made up of many random events.
yeah,
So
yeah.
that is fooled by. So 2001, he wrote the book Fooled by Randomness. But what really put him on the map was in 2007, he wrote a book called Black Swan. So Black Swan picks up where Fooled by Randomness leaves off. Yes, it's easy to get fooled by randomness. The other error that statisticians, policymakers make is if a statistical anomaly shows up in your data, you're taught to ignore it because it's an anomaly. It doesn't happen very often, therefore it can be ignored. Well, the problem is oftentimes that statistical anomaly, there's what he calls a black swan, just an unforeseen, it could be a cataclysmic event that could disrupt everything. But because we use statistics to justify ignoring it, that exacerbates whatever disaster ends up happening. So what an example of how this might play in the real world, the average annual income of a resident of Seattle, Washington is around $90,000. Okay, as an example. But if you remove Bill Gates from the population of Seattle, that average drops significantly down to 80,000. So understanding, but that statistical anomaly of Bill Gates' annual income is incredibly important, but we're taught to ignore statistical anomalies. So black swan, and because we do that, we leave ourselves open to black swan events. And so 2000, that came out in 2007, the 2008 financial crisis. So people looked at Taleb and his points in Black Swan and said, oh, he predicted the 2008 financial crisis.
Yeah, and I personally, the whole idea that he predicted the 2008 financial crisis or anything else for that matter is like kind of silly and almost goes against the whole concept of Black Swan.
Exactly.
I think what in his books, he says, well, I didn't exactly predict. I saw fragilities or whatever, which I also think is kind of BS. He's a master self-promoter on a lot of that stuff. But with that, all that being said, I do like, again, I found the central concept of that book to be helpful. Now, what Francois points out, and Francois is less generous with Taleb than either of us are, I think, thus far, although I'm harsher with Taleb, I think, on some points. But Francois points out that none of these concepts are original to Taleb, which is true. And Taleb kind of gets credit for discovering Black Swan or Fooled by Randomness or whatever. And reality, lots of other books have talked about these concepts. But with all that being said, it was new to me, and I found that concept really helpful. I found the idea that the central concept of Black Swan in my mind is this idea that we all think we can predict the future. We all think we know what's coming. We'll watch documentaries on why World War I happened, and we'll see, oh, this happened and there was this treaty, and therefore, of course, World War I happened. But at the moment, nobody predicted World War I. Like at the moment, you look at the financial markets, and they were all acting like there was never going to be a war, and it was only after war broke out that people realized there was a war, and then even after war broke out, people thought it was going to end quickly, right?
Yes.
So there's that retrospective ability to predict, retroactive ability to predict, where we go back and we say, yeah, of course we could have predicted that. Yeah, of course he should. Why didn't he predict that? He should have known at the moment that it was going to happen, because obviously XYZ happened, and of course he should have seen it. That concept of actually the future is almost always unpredictable.
Yeah.
And especially, as you said, those big events that make the biggest impact are often completely impossible. And another example is, you design, you build your house far enough away from the river so that it never, you go back in time and you say, what's the biggest flood we've ever had? The biggest flood we ever had was in 1813, and there was a flood that went out 20 feet from the river. And so therefore I'm going to build my house, I'm going to put a safety factor, I'm going to build it out 30 feet from the river, and as a result I'll be safe because I went back in time and I found the worst flood. Well, of course, that worst flood at the time was that was a record at the time. So if before that, maybe it was 10 feet. So you built your house 20 feet and your house got flooded or whatever. So that idea that there's always going to be this event that nobody could see coming. There's going to be a bigger earthquake. There's going to be a bigger event. There's going to be a nuclear war. There's going to be some kind of event that comes up that nobody saw happening beforehand.
Then after the fact, it was
after
very
the fact,
obvious
like,
that was going to happen.
Of course, yeah. There was a lot of rain that year. They should have known. Blah blah blah. So I found that helpful.
Absolutely. And another example, like the Civil War, I read a really good book. When the Civil War first broke out, the Union Army had 90-day conscriptions only. So when you signed up to fight the war, it was only at 90 days because they thought it was going to get wrapped up very quickly. There was going to be this long 5 years later war. Like, yeah, and of course, in hindsight, you're like, well, yeah, of course, the country's tearing itself apart over very, very big issues. Of course, it lasted that long. It wasn't obvious at the time. So very, very good book. It's important. Really, really good ideas. And I think to your larger point that, yes, other people had these ideas before, but through Taleb, this became more pop culture, more mainstream, these important ideas. So I, grateful for that. In spite of the man, grateful for his contributions to these larger conversations about risk, about predicting the future. These are important. We need to stop pretending that the future is so obvious and predictable. It's anything but.
Yeah, absolutely.
Bed of Proscutes. I don't know if I pronounced that.
I say Procustus.
Procustus. There we go. That was his book after Black Swan. I read some of it, but it's a lot. So it's set up like
Aphorisms. It's a book of
yeah.
aphorisms. So yeah, I actually read that book.
Okay, go ahead, please.
So Bed of Procrustes is just a series of aphorisms, and I wish I brought the quote. I did not, but um, when I said that it was a cult, that Taleb was a cult, that book is actually a great proof of that, in that it is written almost like religious phrases.
Right. It's not a traditional text.
It's almost written like sayings of Jesus or something, where he'll have these little phrases, some of them funny, some of them wisdom, some of them inspired, those kind of things. But he's just like a sentence or two of wisdom, Taleb wisdom. And it's interesting. I think in the intro, and this is where I wish I brought the quote, but in the intro, he says he takes walks very slowly, and the ideas just come to him from the other world or something like that.
Oh, nice.
So he actually says he's a prophet, like that. Those are almost words of the prophet coming to him. So
the prophet Taleb.
Yeah. So there is that religious element to Bed of Procrustes for sure. I read it. Some of the stuff was kind of interesting, little catchphrases. When I still liked Celeb, I thought some of them were kind of cool. But as a whole, no real central idea to that book.
No.
It's in many ways just an echo of his ideas that you'll find in his other books.
So people understand the reference. Procrustes is from a Greek myth, right? Procrustes was a guy, whenever he had a guest come to his house, he had a bed for them to sleep in. If they were too short, right, their feet didn't reach the length of the bed, Procrustes would stretch them out and take ropes, whatever, stretch them to make them fit the bed. And if they were too tall, if their feet hung off the edge of the bed, he would cut them off.
Right. So it was a form of torture for his guests. You either got stretched out or cut off as a result.
And Taleb uses that story as a metaphor for how oftentimes policymakers will come up with these models. Economists will come up with models and then cram the data into the model to make it work. Absolutely, that happens.
And the other reference that I think he mentions in the book is that we also do that with like kids in school. So
sure,
little boys have trouble sitting through first and second grade, and so rather than changing first and second grade to make it fit the boys, we give the boys medicine for being ADHD or whatever, and then we make the boys fit the school, which is exactly so it's a good that's a good concept. But anyway, like I said, the book is kind of weird, honestly, and also is a great, if you wanted to argue this is a cult, this is a great proof for that.
Yeah, it's like you read some of these things and you're like, I guess that makes sense. And like, well, you just have to really, really meditate on these sayings to really ascertain the wisdom behind. Like, good grief.
Yeah, I think he somewhat intentionally wrote it as a religious book. Almost. He's got a little bit of megalomania to him for sure. So.
Antifragile was his next book. I really like this book. So the idea is in the English language, when we're describing systems, we know that systems can be fragile, right? Systems can be, when systems encounter chaos, they can become broken because of their fragility, right? So buildings can be fragile towards tornadoes. Ideas can be fragile to skepticism. So when we try to think of the opposite of fragile in those terms, oftentimes we describe the opposite of fragile as robust, which Taleb argues in this book is not a good way. It's not a true opposite of fragile. Robust means that it stands up to and it resists the chaos. It does not succumb to the destruction that the chaos brings. But that's not because fragility is being affected by and being destroyed by chaos. So robust isn't really the opposite. A true opposite would be something that thrives that gets better because of chaos. He uses the example of the Hydra in Greek mythology. When Hercules has to defeat this multi-headed beast, he cuts off one of the heads, and in its place, two heads grow. As Hercules is bringing chaos and destruction to the Hydra is getting bigger and stronger because of the chaos. So there isn't really a word that describes, because that's not the Hydra is not being robust. It's not merely standing up to chaos. It's thriving off of it. And there isn't really a good word in the English language to describe the true opposite of fragile. So Taleb just simply comes up with anti-fragile, which he says in the book is not a good word, but they're really, and I agree, like it's a very interesting concept that does not have a good English word for it. I'm not sure if there's other languages that might describe it better, but that's essentially the core thesis of the Anti-Fragile book.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting concept, and definitely a helpful idea that there's some things, and actually living systems, he touches on this a lot in the book. Living systems are almost always anti-fragile to an extent, right? So if you think about just your own body, something that's fragile, you put on a shelf and you don't move it, right? A teacup, for example, you put on a shelf and you don't move it, and the more you move it, the more likely it is to be hurt and damaged. So you might do it occasionally for a nice tea party or whatever with your friends, but for the most part, you leave it on the shelf. Some living systems are the opposite, where they need to be moved. Your body you need to get up and move every day. You need to lift weights. You need to take walks. You need to take a run. You need to, those within, to an extent, your body needs to be shaken,
Yes.
and he talks about that to describe what he means by the word anti-fragile is if you got a package and the package says fragile, that means don't move it. If the package says robust, that means you can move it if you want, but you could also leave it there. It doesn't matter. What's inside doesn't care. And then anti-fragile the box would say shake it on there. And your box needs to be shaken. It needs to be moved. And there's a lot of things in life that need to be moved. And I think his main point in the book is from a financial standpoint and also from other aspects of life, rather than trying to design our portfolio based on the idea that everything's going to stay mostly the same, that we should design our portfolio, kind of going back to the Black Swan concept, for big shakes. We should be ready for big shakes. We should be ready if there's a economic collapse, or if there's a COVID-19 or whatever. We should be ready for those things and have our portfolio not only survive those things, not only be robust to those things, but to benefit from those things. And I find that an interesting idea. I will say it's incredibly hard from a financial standpoint to actually make it work. And when you ask Taleb for specifics on that, he never gives specifics on that.
No,
and
he cut his teeth as a trader, right? So before Fooled by Randomness, he, Lebanese American, he moved to New York City and became a trader, right? He had made his living off of being able to navigate the markets and make money for his firm. But to your point, he has never released his year-over-year returns that he was able to produce. Like, is he actually taking these principles that he espouses and making meaningful money over it? I don't know.
Yeah. He has never released that, including the hedge funds that he's been a part of, including, like how much is, when I read his books, I assumed he was like this worth 100 million. This guy made big money, back in the day. But now there's a big part of me that wonders, is he rich only because he sold 3 best-selling books? Is that how he got rich? Is he rich just from his books? And maybe Yeah, it's possible. Like
Well,
you have 3 best-selling books, you can make a lot of money. Plus, he's a professor at NYU or whatever. Um,
so
there's money to be had in book writing, and it's possible that his hedge fund trading is not that great. I know that like this during COVID, the hedge fund he was associated with posted a big return when the stock market dropped.
yeah.
But I remember one
Well,
of his critics pointed out that if you took like a 3-year average, it actually was down, right?
right.
So
So
like
this is the problem. So Mark, what's his name? Mark Spitznagel. He wrote a book. He's big. He's friends with Taleb. They talk trading philosophy, whatever. So he goes in. The book is about Taoism and trading, whatever. It was an interesting read. And towards the end, he gets in more into specifics of how he develops his trading, which I don't wonder Taleb also uses as well. Big part of the trading strategy is getting puts. So puts are a contract that allows you to put the stock that you're contracted to buy, you're allowed to put that to somebody else at a lower price. So if you think that a stock is going to drop in value, buy some puts. You don't have to put up as much money as you might otherwise if you just bought it outright. And then if you're right, that stock price drops in value, you're able to put that stock to whoever's holding the other side of that contract. So, but if those contracts have expiration dates, right? If I go and buy a put, I can buy different puts for like puts that expire in August, September, next year. And those are going to be, they're going to charge different premiums for those contracts. So if you're constantly doing that and it doesn't drop in value, it becomes expensive trying to buy puts on. And I do know that he's lost a lot of money trying to buy puts on Tesla. He's been Spitznagel. He's been anti-Tesla for a long time, like a lot of people. And he's loaded up on puts, and all that money is vaporized because Tesla never dropped in price where those contracts would be worth anything.
Yeah.
So I don't wonder if and they're very much about precious metals, which I'm not against, but it's very hard to make a big return on precious metals. Like and that's coming from somebody who bought silver at its high back in 2011. It was trading $41 an ounce, and I bought silver. I think it's under $20 an ounce right now. So
it's like
precious. It's very hard to time. Yeah. Precious metal.
Yeah, that's the challenge. I would say that's the challenge with the whole book of Antifragile, right? So like the concept sounds cool. It's interesting stories, well told book. Concept is interesting, and in some ways, I think probably valuable. But how to make it valuable is incredibly difficult to apply. There's a lot of controversy whether Taleb himself has made it work. And like when you sit down after reading that book and you're like, this is a great concept, how can I apply this and make myself rich? It's so impossible to say. And like if you go and then you ask like Taleb like how to do it, like he won't, his Real World Risk Institute, like they don't explain like, okay, here's how you invest your money. It's
very esoteric, their conversations.
Yeah. And it's very hard to apply. And the other big thing with the whole getting ready for a big shake is that is very helpful if a big shake actually comes, right? So if I say, hey, listen, I think that the housing market is going to collapse, therefore I'm going to short the housing market, or I'm going to sell all my real estate assets and or whatever, like you come up with and you get the timing wrong. You could be right. You could be 100% right. And actually this happened with the housing market collapse in 2008, is there was a lot of people that predicted the housing market collapse, but did so too early. They predicted like 4 years early, and they lost and they lost and they lost and they lost. And then they finally quit their short position. And it was then that it collapsed.
Yes.
And
Yes.
and there can be aspects to that whole building your anti-fragile portfolio where you live your whole life, you prep for a nuclear war or whatever, and the nuclear war never comes. And so you just lived kind of a beat up portfolio, beat up life, paranoid life of worried about the worst thing that's going to happen, and it never happens. And that's not really beneficial for you as a human being. Now, his big thing is it's about survival, which is fine. Like if you survive, great. But like, there's a lot of people that will survive that didn't even think about these things, right? So.
Yeah. Well, and as somebody who works in insurance, nobody wants to pay the premium for insurance policies, right? They never want to do it until they need the insurance, until the cataclysmic event occurred, right? Yeah. The other thing I think it is worth identifying anti-fragile systems and defending them. And I would argue that our legal system in America, in the West at large, is anti-fragile. This at lower. I read an article about how in China they were trying to come up with a legal definition for like cryptocurrency, right? Because in China and there are other countries, legal terms, law comes from the top down. In the West, we have this bottom up where lower courts, so I can sue somebody for Bitcoin, right? And if a lower court takes that there and develops a ruling on the matter, that has an effect on jurisprudence. Perhaps then it would go to an appeals court and then it gets hammered out further. But there's this element where in Western jurisprudence, we develop terms, systems of law that oftentimes come from the bottom and rise their way to the top. We do have legislation and laws coming from the top, of course, but a lot of the stuff that we deal with is actually evolving at the bottom. So in a very anti-fragile way, because our legal system is built to respond to crazy legal scenarios. And as a result, our jurisprudence evolves much more quickly, much more efficiently than other systems might otherwise.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Yeah, there's definitely that concept of anti-fragile applied to a lot of different systems. It's an interesting way of looking at life. Like there's no, it's worth a read, worth a concept. But my main critique with that book is just application beyond observation, right?
The application is hard. It could be a lot shorter too. That's one of his longer books, and it certainly doesn't need to be.
Yeah.
And then his last book so far is Skin in the Game. And I read it and I was appalled at how there were not a single new idea in the book. It was really just a rehashing of all of the ideas that he's touched on in his previous books. The central thesis is people need to have skin in the game. If he talks about in Rome, if an architect built a bridge, the law said that the architect and his family had to live under the bridge for however many days. That ensured that the architect built the bridge safely and efficiently. It wasn't going to collapse. And living under the bridge would prompt the architect to build it correctly so that it wouldn't collapse and crush him and his family. They had the law prompted the architect to put skin in the game, right? But if you've read any of Taleb's other books, he's talked about it multiple times. So it was, I don't know, like, what are your thoughts on that book?
Yeah, that book I found to be by far his most worthless book. Like even worse than Better Progressives. Like that book, I was at the time still a Taleb fan, and I was really looking forward to reading it. And then when I read it, I was like, oh my goodness, this is garbage. And it's a concept that he talks about in all the other books. It's also like we talked earlier about the fact that these ideas aren't original to Taleb. This is one that's like not original at all. This is
No.
one that's in widespread already circles for everything from the phrase "skin in the game" to in financial and government institutions. There's a simple phrase that's moral hazard that is talked about all the time with regards to executives not being properly incentivized so that they don't have skin in the game. That's just it's a very typical thing that everybody thinks about, is how can we make sure that interests are aligned for the people we have employed at our company. That's why we give stock options to executives. That's why we do, so the whole concept is I felt like he just needed to write another book. Maybe he was running out of money. Maybe it's
a money grab.
Portfolio
it was a money grab. Absolutely. Nothing original. Like and then it really caused me to kind of look back and be like, boy, he kind of takes all of his books kind of cover the same general ideas, right? Like in Antifragile, he doesn't use the term anti-fragile, but he alludes to those ideas in his previous books. It's a very frustrating read, Skin in the Game.
And then the other thing about that book that I found frustrating, beyond the fact that it was not original or interesting, was that he makes some comments on religion that are factually wrong.
Please talk about that.
So he talks about the foundation of Christianity, talks about he basically makes the argument that early Christianity got a lot of its concepts from paganism.
I do kind of remember this. Yeah.
And then also talks about, he's got a big section where he talks about pagans being more tolerant to other religions than monotheistic religions. He badmouths kind of fundamental Christianity, Protestant Christianity, as well as Islam. It's interesting. Like, I almost felt like after reading that book, he talks about the fact that he's Eastern Orthodox or Greek Orthodox or whatever. And I felt like after reading that book, I'm like, he's actually a pagan. Like he believes, he likes paganism. Like he likes ancient paganism, Roman,
or at the
paganism.
very least a universalist.
And I think so there was some factual religious problems with that book, stuff that I actually wrote little responses at the time, because I was like, hey, maybe he just doesn't realize this. And like I of course got zero reception from him. I wrote like a little review and then posted it, and I'm lucky I didn't get blocked then. That was close to when I was about to get blocked. I didn't get blocked until after COVID, but that was very
Which by the way, both you and I are blocked on Twitter by Taleb. Taleb has seen us and found our lack of belief troubling and blocked us as a result. So Skin in the Game, not a good book. Then
not worth the read.
And then so that's his contribution to the society, to the world at large, these books, those ideas. And obviously we're in the podcast form, we're just trying to do generalizations and flesh them out more. I'm sure people can pick through and that's fine. Now COVID, right? So actually, two things, and sort of how we lost our appreciation of Taleb was Skin in the Game we talked about, but then Taleb and COVID. And then Taleb on Edward Snowden, you had some notes on that too. But
Lucas, let me real quick. Can I give a summary of all his books and just like say,
absolutely,
in general, if you listen to everything we just said, let's say you haven't read Taleb and you know nothing about him. In general, his concepts are kind of true concepts. They're helpful if you think about the things we talked about, like data being noisy and not to trust trends. The future being unpredictable, systems that benefit from shakiness. Like those are all good and true concepts, but they're not exactly earth shaking, right? Like when you step back, they're not earth shaking. But the way he writes, and I think the way he gets a cult following or whatever, he writes as though they are earth shaking ideas, right? He writes as though they're this new philosophy of life that if you embrace, you can be the Superman, like you can go through life and you're powerful. And he paints himself as this powerful Superman that is able to see fragile systems and benefit, etc. And as a result, his followers kind of all have that idea of like, I'm a Superman, right? All his followers have, it's an interesting concept when you engage with one of his followers. They kind of have that puffed up, I know how to get through life kind of concept. So anyway, it can be confusing to people that have no idea who he is or haven't read his books. But he's an adept enough writer where he's able to take kind of basic concepts that on some level we all understand and make it seem like it's this profound, almost religious truth that transforms people and makes people better and powerful people by following those steps.
But I will say that through him, I was able to find you, Francois. There's some other authors too. There was a book that Taleb cited about how actually oftentimes when we look at data, it does come in very small lumps, right? If you look at people who write, like a college professor who, and we're trying to figure out how to schedule like when he does emails. Well, he's certainly not going to be writing emails when there's class going on, right? He'll get little breaks during the day and there'll be clumps of emails, but you can look at that activity and be like, oh, he writes at 1:30, he'll send 5 or 6 emails without the context of, he's not writing at 1:00 because he's in the middle of a lecture. Oftentimes the data just gives you one scope and like, well, 1:30 must be really important. Like, well, 1:30 is when he has a break. It's so like those type of books, those type of ideas that help us to divorce ourselves from this idea that statisticians can predict the future. Like they find meaningful things, no doubt, but oftentimes their ideas are oversubscribed, fail to take into consideration other reasons for why the data looks like it does, ignore statistical anomaly, like everything that we've talked about. So, okay, now Taleb on COVID. We kind of touched on this earlier, and then Taleb on Edward Snowden. But yeah, if you want to kind of, Lewis, maybe explain to us his take on COVID and why it was so bizarre because of his material that he's written previously.
Yeah, so I think COVID for me was like this, and I think almost for everybody else was this anybody that had followed Taleb, knew about Taleb, read Taleb's books, maybe was a fan of Taleb, maybe even was a cult member of Taleb. Like there has been a lot of people where COVID was this great pulling away of the sheet, this Wizard of Oz moment where the man behind the curtain is revealed. And his response to COVID, particularly as it progressed, as we got out of kind of the early days of COVID and we went further into kind of the response, the lockdowns, the masks, the vaccinations, etc. It was a revelation of Taleb, of a side a lot of people hadn't seen of him, and an application of solutions to COVID that a lot of people were pretty shocked by, given how he comes across in the books, what he says are his philosophy in the books. So a lot of people that, like I said, were cult members of his that followed his philosophy down to the T, all of a sudden got woken up out of that cult and I saw people that were big fans of Taleb that stopped being fans of him thanks to COVID. I found this quote in Taleb's Fooled by Randomness book. He talks about the philosopher Karl Popper. Karl Popper is a philosopher that Taleb quotes quite a bit and likes, but he writes in Fooled by Randomness, he says, quote, "I have some sobering information about Popper the man. Witnesses of his private life find him rather unpopperian." He then goes on to explain all the sorts of ways that Popper failed to live and act according to his own philosophy. And I've very much applied that to Taleb, where like Taleb is very un-Talebian, particularly with regards to COVID. So let me real quickly talk about kind of, this was where I really broke with Taleb and went from being a Taleb fan to being a very big opposer of Taleb. Was during COVID. And it's, when he blocked me and when, everything kind of went sideways with regards to that, so in the early days of COVID, like I said, Taleb wrote that precautionary principle paper. He wrote it with Joe Norman and that Yanir guy. I can't remember his name.
I was going to talk about him too.
And basically the concept was, hey, we don't know what this is. Therefore, it's dangerous and we should all
do everything we can.
Do everything we can to stop it. Which, like I said, is somewhat consistent with his whole fear of black swans, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, precautionary principle.
And the precautionary principle, for those that don't know, is this idea that, if you're in the woods and you see in the distance a big black thing and you think it might be a bear, but it might be a rock, it's better to treat it like it's a bear than to just assume it's a rock, because if you run away from the black thing in the distance, and it turns out that it was a bear, you saved your life. If you run away from it and it turns out it's a rock, you're not really hurt, right? That's the idea of the precautionary principle, is that, could be a bear, could be a rock, but you treat it like it's a bear because that's, there's limited downside to running away from it. Now it's worth noting that sometimes the precautionary principle can absolutely have a big downside. Let's say you're starving to death in the woods and right next to the big black thing is a bunch of food. Running away at that moment could cause you to starve to death, right? So there could be a giant downside. And I think as Taleb rolled out his precautionary principle with regards to COVID, I think we as a world started to make some decisions that literally caused people to starve to death, literally caused, civic and civil unrest, literally caused governments to gain power that they have not given back, literally caused. So by running away from COVID, there was not zero cost to the country or to the world. There actually was certainly a cost. And my bigger disappointment with Taleb was not that initial precautionary principle paper, which, like I said, to some degree was consistent with his ideas, but it was, as time went on, we realized what COVID was, and we realized death rates, and we realized growth rates, and how quickly people were getting affected, and so we got a sense of how dangerous or not that it was. And his principles, his statements on it, his affirmations on what government should do, never softened, right? So to go back to the bear analogy, this would be like if you see a rock in the distance and you're not sure if it's a bear or a rock, and so you run away, but then you get a better look at it and it looks more like a rock, right? And you still run away, and then you get an even better look, and then after a while you're almost certain it's a rock and you're still running away. It's at that point in time, it becomes madness. It ceases to be kind of a good, wise thing to do. and it becomes madness. And I felt that's what happened with COVID, where it was
Yeah.
like maybe in January you could argue that was a bear, but by March, April, June, he's still calling for lockdowns, and he's still attacking people like Elon Musk that wants to keep his factory running rather than lock down. And he's still attacking anyone that says, hey, what if there's some downsides to the lockdowns, right? What if the lockdowns are a bear, right? What if the lockdowns will cause starvation? What if people die of suicide? What if people die of, what if there's health issues to people that don't go into the hospital because they can't?
Yeah. What
if there's a mental health crisis? Like that bear, he never looked at, right? And I think for a lot of his followers, it was like, what is going on? Like, how is this guy that's supposedly on the lookout for bears not seeing these potential bears?
And when people would point out the potential black swan that lied with the like, oh, hey, like here's a new disease that just popped up. And then all of us, not even a year later, 4 pharmaceutical companies have vaccines for it. That's incredible. Is there a possibility, because this is so new, that there's vaccine injuries? Is there maybe a potential black swan that lies behind the vaccines, as good as they may be? Anytime someone brought that up, boy, he was quick to shut that down.
And like the fact that they're new technology, this mRNA and like brand new technology. Like here's a guy like Taleb was like against GMOs, against genetically modified
that's a
foods
that's a
and
great
all that
point.
stuff.
Yep.
And like it was like a blind spot for him. Like you said, it wasn't fighting against it. It was an active. Anybody that expressed those concerns got blocked, got called an idiot, got he attempted to destroy anybody that even expressed those concerns. And it was, for me, it was, and I mentioned this in the last podcast, it was like hearing your local pastor has been just this anti-adultery, preaching about the importance of marriage, et cetera, and you find out that he's got 15 prostitutes that he's been going to, and like it just, for me, it was like, whoa, like he doesn't believe anything that he taught. He doesn't believe like none of these books that I thought had helpful concepts. He doesn't believe in any of those concepts. It's like it was a crazy, and part of my fascination with Taleb is that it's like, seeing someone that you thought you knew. It's kind of like O.J. Simpson in the murder trial, where I loved as a kid. I loved O.J. Simpson. Naked Gun movies, seemed like a really nice guy. And like then all of a sudden finding out like he murdered his wife and a waitress, I'm like, wow, like that doesn't. How does that even work? And I feel that
allegedly.
I feel that way with Taleb, where I'm like it just doesn't match. Those two things don't match. Like, how is he not? He seems like he should be the primary voice worried about the mRNA vaccines or whatever. And rather than being the primary concern, he's the primary proponent. And it's like this wild twist to Taleb's whole career.
Yep. Exactly. And then he got into a kerfuffle with Edward Snowden. Edward Snowden, you guys might remember, was the NSA contractor who leaked a bunch of data on how the United States was spying on Americans, and gave that information to journalists like Glenn Greenwald. And then he went off to, I think he's in Russia somewhere now, hiding out because there's a warrant for his arrest by American authorities. And Snowden's active on Twitter sometimes, and I have to look at what it was that they were arguing about.
I can tell you that where kind of the source of the argument.
Sure, go ahead.
From. So there was a Taleb was anti-Bitcoin, which honestly kind of I am too, but like he had criticized fairly harshly a person named Lynn, I don't know, someone
Lynn
in the
Alden,
in the Bitcoin world, and Snowden just responded, something along the lines of, why is Taleb attacking this person? And that insult from Snowden took Taleb from who previous to that moment had always been fairly positive towards Snowden. He had good things to say about Snowden prior to that, had never been a critic of him. Taleb took that personal insult, that just like that little mild criticism of Taleb, he took that and decided to go to war against Snowden. Yeah. And so first, after, one of the interesting things about Taleb is he's anti-debate. He's like, never debate your enemies. That's part of the whole block thing. It's like, never debate your enemies. Well, first he says, I want to debate Snowden. And he starts online over and over again saying, debate me, bro. Debate me, bro. To Snowden. And I was like, what? Like, I thought you were against debates. And like, he's trying to get Snowden to debate him. And then Snowden, of course, ignores him and kind of makes fun of him. And so eventually Taleb gets so mad that he decides Snowden no longer is a national hero for exposing the government spying on us. Snowden, which by the way, skin in the game, he like gave up his life in America, went to Russia. Yes, as continues to be an outspoken advocate for online privacy, but because of that insult, and it was nakedly that fact, Taleb decides that the Snowden story has been told wrong, and that Snowden is in fact a traitor. Yes. And so like he goes with the CIA talking points, like Taleb goes full CIA.
And then
he's
he
like, actually,
he incorporates the skin in the game. He says if Snowden actually had skin in the game, he would have stayed in America after he. I'm like, what?
Yeah,
what?
It makes no sense. And like, he also is like, well, if he has skin in the game, he should be criticizing Russia. Like, why does he criticize Russia? Which like, I'm like, Taleb, you're like preaching Pfizer to everybody. You're like saying exactly what your government wants. How about Taleb? How about you start exposing? Why don't you go to Russia and start criticizing Putin? Like you're Taleb's anti-Putin. Why go to Russia and you criticize Putin in Russia? Then you can criticize Snowden for not saying anything.
And then I don't know if you remember this. After the whole Snowden dust up, there were photos started being posted about Taleb actually hanging out with Epstein and all these big wigs.
Yeah.
And I'm not insinuating that Taleb went to Epstein Island, whatever.
A little bit. Like,
I'll let you do that. That's fine. I'm not insinuating that, but I will say that it's as you're like, wait a minute, like you're always criticizing the big wigs, but actually you're buddies with all these guys. Like, everything about you is fake.
Yeah. And there's been a lot of people that have said, okay, why is Taleb going against his whole philosophy? And there's been a lot of people that have speculated on, is there some kind of compromise for him? Is he being pressured? And that's where the Epstein theory comes in. And it's worth noting that he did run in the same circles as Epstein. Yeah. He lived in New York when Epstein was throwing parties for big academics. Actually, Taleb admitted, I think in one of his tweets, admitted to driving Manuel Mandelbrot to a Epstein party. And we know that Taleb is, hangs out with George Soros. There's photos of him in that case. So I don't know that that's true, but it is a possible explanation for why a guy would go against his whole philosophy and like go full Pfizer on board things. So again, speculation, but what is
what's not speculation is that he most certainly does run in those circles, right? And it's, even though you read his books, he's anti establishment, right? It seems to be a big vein in all of his work, is this anti-establishment, people pretending to do things that have no skin in the game. He deplores people who have immense power that have no skin in the game. Yet, who is he hanging out with?
Yeah, the power. Yeah. He's
they don't have skin in the game.
Yeah, and then that's the other thing that like frustrates me about him. When it comes to skin in the game, right? He advocated lockdowns like crazy, and he is a rich author.
Mhm.
who actually has, if you believe him, he has financial portfolio that benefits from
From
financial
chaos.
shakes and
Yep.
chaos. So here he is advocating lockdowns that put poor people out of jobs, that put poor nations in a situation where they starving to death, that does great harm to third world nations, does great harm to kind of the most vulnerable parts of society, that stopped people from being able to worship, stops kind of the religious working class from being able to live their lives, that causes mental anguish, etc. And none of that affects him.
No.
He actually benefits, if you trust what he says about his portfolio, he benefits from it. So from his own skin in the game, never trust anybody that doesn't have skin in the game. He does not have skin in the game for this, and he's doing great harm and great damage to everybody else. And so for me, it went from like, what? This doesn't match his philosophy, to this dude's evil. Like, he's doing bad stuff. He's hurting the little guy to his own benefit, or at least to his own neutrality. So the whole concept of skin in the game went very much against the board. And the other aspect of it's a similar overlap between his fallout with Snowden and his COVID response, is that one of the ideas that I thought was consistent with him was this idea of not centralizing power, right? Not centralizing the ability of people to control large groups of people. Ideally, he talks about Switzerland, of there's all these different regions within Switzerland. People don't even know who the president is, et cetera, et cetera. And he talks about that like a good thing. But with COVID, it was like, we need a centralized response. We need a worldwide response. We need to take people's rights away temporarily. We need to like silent, and it was this giant power shift, and there was no warning, sometimes you make a decision and you say, yeah, there's a giant risk here, but it needs to be done. There was no hedging like that. There was no explanation of like, yeah, this is bad to centralize this power, but we have to do it to stop this disease. He didn't say that. It was like he saw no risk of government overreach and no risk of giving that much power to the government. And similar to the whole Snowden thing, where he sees no risk of like government having all of our data, government having all these things in a centralized database, being able to see everything we're doing all the time, everywhere, keep a permanent record of all those things. Taleb doesn't see any risk there. And it's like, here's a guy that theoretically, reading his books, you would think that he would be
Gravely concerned.
Yeah, very, very concerned about these things. And instead, he is the biggest cheerleader of government power. And that's where the Epstein theories come in.
That Snowden. Right. Yeah, it was like, because of the circles he runs in. Yeah, it does make sense that he's taken the narratives that he's taken, and then the whole Snowden thing turning on a dime because Snowden didn't like the tone that he had in those tweets, whatever. Like that. Like I think about that Michael Jordan meme of, and I took that personally, be like, Snowden says you're grouchy, and I took that personally. It's like, what a ridiculous, like, just the softest skin.
Yeah, it was the most thin skin, and it was doing something evil because of a personal slight, right? So it's for me, it went beyond. It was so nakedly wrong over such a small thing. And like, for me, it was just this giant character flaw of like, it would be akin to like a dictator that decides to declare war because someone didn't bow properly to him from a different country or whatever. It's just like a really, really bad thing. And yet he chose to do it. And so, that's, for me, that's the great disappointment with Taleb, is I went from someone that appreciated him to someone that thinks this is a guy that is a very bad force in the world, doing bad things, that has giant character flaws, that is advocating some of the worst things that are going on in society right now.
Yep. So that's our take on the rise and fall of Nassim Taleb. What's the moral of the story? I think, in summary, very, very interesting ideas that Taleb promotes. There's some of those books we talked about, both Lewis and I agree, those are ideas that are worthwhile reads if you want to, some worthwhile things to think about it, very interesting. But yeah, ultimately, there's this, he doesn't believe what he preaches. He has this cult of personality. Nobody loves Taleb more than himself. If you follow him on Twitter for any amount of time, you can definitely see that. But yeah, so that's our take on Taleb. Anything else you'd want to add to the summary, Lewis?
No, not really. Like I feel like it's an interesting case study, and it's definitely someone that I kind of put in that, like I said, that O.J. Simpson category, where it's a guy you just didn't see it coming. And for me, it's interesting if for no other reason, just that.
Gotcha. Yep. If you like the podcast, make sure to like, subscribe, give us reviews. We would love to try to keep having these type of conversations going forward. Also, follow us on Twitter. We'll have that information in the podcast. And one thing that we like to do, so Lewis will get this posted on all of our podcast, like YouTube, and then I will go re-listen to the podcast and the different things that Lewis and I cited. I will go and find those resources and put it in a giant thread. So if you want to listen to the podcast and have the resource, like have what we're talking about, I'll go and find the tweets from Taleb. I'll find the books and put that in the thread. I did that for the first episode. I love doing that because it allows me to make sure that I know what I'm talking, right? Like in the first episode, I talked about Bitcoin pizza buying. I thought it was 2012. Article actually happened in 2010. So I like doing that too, to keep me straight. Look for those threads, share that with people. Anything else before we sign off, Lewis?
Like and subscribe. If you want my Twitter handle, it's I am Lewis U. So I am Lewis U, and follow me on Twitter. And thank you for listening.
Yep. And I'm at Addicted to Grace, number 2. Addicted to Grace on Twitter. All right. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, everybody.